Honourable Member for Vancouver, Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I originally stood in this House on June 18th, 2012, and posed a question in response to the announcement of the Conservatives that Canada would join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they followed on an announcement of a new advisory panel on international trade issues. At that time, the Minister of International Trade announced the formation of a trade committee, and he appointed panel members, all of whom represent a one-sided ideological approach to trade policy. This panel has no representative of organized labour, no representative of environmental organizations, no representatives of human rights organizations, and not a single representative from our supply-managed industries, a sector that will be the subject of much discussion in trade talks, especially the TPP. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a plurilateral trade and investment agreement being negotiated amongst 9 countries: the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, Peru, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, with the U.S. leading the negotiations. The aim is to create a new template for future trade deals modeled on U.S. interests. 14 rounds of TPP negotiations have already taken place, with the next round in New Zealand in December of this year. The negotiating text is under tight secrecy, though draft versions of the investment chapter and the U.S. position on intellectual property have been leaked. Canada has been lobbying for years to join the negotiations, but there's been stiff resistance from the U.S. and other trade partners, such as New Zealand, concerned about Canada's position in specific areas, including protection of supply-managed agricultural sectors. On June 19th of this year, the Prime Minister announced that Canada had been invited into the negotiations, but there's a significant concern at the price of admission. It appears the Conservative government has acceded to U.S. demands that dramatically curtail Canada's negotiating rights and powers. These demands include that Canada would have no ability to change anything that the 9 original TPP countries have already agreed to. In other words, Canada has agreed, without seeing it, to the existing unbracketed text, sight unseen, without input. Second, Canada will not have any veto authority over any chapter. This means that should the other 9 countries agree on terms, Canada would be required to accept them. This context has led commentators to characterize Canada's entry into the TPP as one with, quote, one hand tied behind our back, end quote, or having second-class status. Now, Canada already has free trade deals with 4 of the current TPP members, the U.S., Chile, Peru, and Mexico. The other 6 countries combined account for less than 1% of Canada's exports. With limited opportunity for significant new market access for Canadian exports, the deal raises alarm bells regarding other aspects of the deal in areas of sensitive policy regulations, such as investor-state provisions, supply management, and intellectual property, chiefly in pharmaceuticals, and copyright. What will the advantage be Canadians want to see? How much will it cost us? Mr. Speaker, the Trade Committee, half of us anyway, were in Japan 2 weeks ago, where we were presented with information from Japanese economic modeling that suggested that without Japan in the TPP, there is no benefit economically to any country in the TPP. With Japan in it, there may be. Now, in terms of the investor-state provision, Mr. Speaker, there are serious concerns being raised. Just last week, Canada faced 2 new suits against Canadian governmental regulations and legislation passed concerning the regulation of fracking in Quebec and concerning the development of wind turbines in Ontario. And essentially what happened is because of investor-state provisions, investors are suing the Canadian government and subjecting taxpayers to millions of dollars of liability simply because the Canadian government has legislated in areas that these investors think may impact on their profits. Now, Australia has adopted a position that investor-state provisions are not part of its trade template, and I would urge the government to follow that lead. In terms of showing up late, it has put Canada at a serious disadvantage in negotiations. Will we have to give up on supply management, on copyright protection? Given the seemingly negligible benefits of the deal, we have to ask ourselves whether this deal is really in Canada's best economic interest, or is it simply a vehicle to slip through right-wing policies that aren't about trade and that Canadians would not support otherwise.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Listen intently. I always listen intently to my colleague from Vancouver, Kingsway. It's always interesting and informative, and you know, it's kind of like any good fiction novel. There's always a storyline. You can follow it along, and he'll get, after a while, work himself into some place where you can actually see that there's a story starting to unfold. So let me start with the boogeyman theory, because that's really what he's talking about. So, you know, the NDP aren't going to support trade, so they need a boogeyman. They need something out there that's going to take Canada's rights away. We'll lose our border. We'll lose our culture. We'll lose our water. We'll lose our self-esteem. We'll lose our children. We'll lose just, you know, our dogs going to run away. Really, Mr. Speaker, it just makes me shake my head. So let's set the record straight. What did Canada give up to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Nothing. Nothing. Zero. We gave up nothing to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, you know, we're a trading nation. Our future, our children's future, is based on trade. We will not exist as a country. We're 33 million people with a vast amount of resources, with a great wealth of individuals and people who make up this nation, who are entrepreneurs, who go out to work every day, who make a living selling things to people in other parts of the world. This is not a complicated issue. We don't need to find a problem with something that's not a problem. We are in the beginning stages of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a lot of negotiating to go on yet. And we'll continue, Mr. Speaker, to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'll continue to negotiate other trade agreements. We formed government in 2006. We signed free trade agreements with 9 countries. We're negotiating another 50 agreements around the world. Mr. Speaker, you know, I'd ask the honourable member to, you know, get on board. So what's the NDP want to talk about? They want to talk about a free trade agreement with India. We're already there. We're already working on that. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No. It's a long series of negotiations ahead of us. Talking about dealing with China. They didn't even support the Foreign Investment Promotion Protection Agreement with China. You know, talking about a free trade agreement with Panama. They voted against that. Mr. Speaker, you can't have it both ways. You can't say we need to be a trading nation and then shut other countries out. And as far as investor-state provisions ensure an investor from a foreign country, but they'll be treated the same as Canadian companies in Canada. There's nothing wrong with that. That's pretty basic stuff. If someone breaks those rules, and there have been hundreds of filings over the years, only 8 of them have been successful. If someone breaks those rules, they have recourse to the courts. That's not unusual. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good way to do business, where you have rules-based trading, everyone knows what they're talking about, everyone plays by the same set of rules, and it's fair straight across the table. I would ask my honourable colleague to stop fear-mongering about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're in the early days of negotiations. There's lots he can do to help if he really wants to take a pro-trade stance. I'm not expecting to see it anytime soon, but if he wants to take that pro-trade stance, there's lots he can do to help with this.
Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable colleague talks about fiction. Given the numbers about trade under this government's watch since 2006, I think we're talking about a horror story. We've gone from a $26 billion trade surplus when the Conservatives took office in 2006 to a $50 billion trade deficit today. Our manufacturing trade deficit in the time the Conservatives came into office has exploded 6 times to over $90 billion today. Exports of raw materials are up $30 billion, but value-added exports are down $35 billion. Now, this government is fond of throwing out numbers, most of them mythical and made up with discredited economic modeling, but those numbers are real, and I don't hear the government responding to it. Supply management is responsible for supporting 17,000 farms in this country, $10 billion in farm cash receipts, 106,000 direct jobs, 300,000 total jobs. I ask my honourable colleague to assure this House that supply management, our system in this country, will not be jeopardized through the end of Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and to make that pledge here in this House to the supply managed sector of this country. They want to know.
Parliamentary Secretary.